Hi, Bob Sullivan, and I'm here with Lauren Sandler, who's an author. And she has a brand new book out called This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. We're lucky to have her here today. It's a busy time, and this is an important time to talk about a book like this. So, Lauren, talk about the book. What's it about?
Hi, Bob. Thank you for inviting me. My book is about a year in the life of a young homeless mother, and it's really about the entire constellation of factors that leaves her homeless. And it's a book of narrative nonfiction. So I wrote it to read like a novel, but one in which every word is true and reported. My feeling is that we have a lot of data about homelessness and poverty. We have a lot of solutions journalism, which somehow people don't seem to listen to about such things. But what I have felt us lacking are stories that we can really get pulled into so that we can experience something almost as though we're reading fiction. And that's what I set out to write. And as you mentioned, it is definitely a story that seems to tragically be increasingly relevant with each passing week right now.
So this is a terrible time to publish a book, but it's also a wonderful time to publish a book. So I'm going to jump to the punchline here. Why is this story so relevant for what's going on right now?
Well, I mean, today we have the news that there are suddenly 36 million Americans who don't have jobs when they used to have jobs when this started. And that, of course, is just the very beginning. My book is about someone who falls through the safety net, someone who is tenacious and ambitious and as organized as anyone I've ever met. And I was reporting it during the Obama era. The year of her life takes place in 2015. And what I saw during that time, a time of unprecedented prosperity with a capable leader in the White House, that was already dystopian. That already felt impossible. And every phase of history that I lived through since this book has been reported, because history has been happening at warp speed since 2015, I have a moment of thinking, oh God, how is this book relevant to how things have just totally changed? And increasingly, it is more and more relevant because the safety net that we should have strengthened during that time of unprecedented prosperity, we shredded instead. And now there will be so many millions of Americans in the same situation as Camilla, my protagonist, who would have never imagined this moment in their lives back when I was reporting the book.
Well, I'd like to talk about this enormous gap that I think is quite artificial between people who are struggling to find a place to live and people who are struggling for the kind of security that comes with knowing you can pay for your kids' college or knowing that the mortgage isn't a problem. Is maybe this time an opportunity for Americans to get a big lesson in empathy?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. The word precariat has certainly been around for the past several years, but it's one that I think a lot of people didn't pay attention to, even if they knew they were in it. A data point that we see a lot is that 60% of the country before the pandemic didn't have an extra $400 to help them out in a crisis in which they might find themselves unemployed, didn't have that degree of security for housing or for food. And I think that we're all aware that there has been incredible price gouging when it comes to housing, that there's one person who I heard say on a Zoom call recently, his name is Daniel Malone, I believe he runs a homelessness organization in Seattle. And he said, I was watching this outrage about price gouging for hand sanitizer and thinking, why is it that we're so upset about this, paying to the high for hand sanitizer when we've been doing this with housing all along? I think that this combination of a shredded safety net, massive unemployment, that 60% without $400, and with years and years and years of housing price gouging has put us in a really terrifying position in which people who thought that they were relatively secure are now suddenly realizing that they aren't. And in fact, that the people who are form such a minority of this country.
This might sound like a backwards question, but what can Camilla teach all these people who are newly understanding how fragile their lives are?
That's a really hard question to answer in a way that sounds anything but dark and pessimistic and tragic. And it's
I was
interesting. I've
designed
been,
for dark and pessimistic people.
I've been talking about the book a lot, as you can imagine, since it came out 2 weeks ago. And it's actually not a question that anyone has posed in quite that way. I think that sadly, what Camilla can teach people is that, well, let me back up. There's this concept called administrative burden. This is not what Camilla calls it. This is what, and a scholar at Georgetown calls it, which is the idea that our social services system is intentionally structured to be impossible, that wait times are impossible, that policy is inconsistent, that paperwork is illegible, and that knowing the impossibility of trying to get help in America means that there are tons of people who give up and say, I don't have the time for this, I don't have the facility for this, or as Camilla would often say, it's just not worth it. And that because all those people fall away, we don't have to support them. So I think that Camilla teaches us what it takes to not give up, what it takes to really figure out how to shoulder administrative burden. She's a model of that. And that is exactly why I wanted to write this book about her, because my feeling was, if this person can't make this work, then no one can. The sad thing that she also teaches us is that she can't, that no one can, that no matter, every one of her professors or caseworkers I ever met marveled at how she could be productive within the system, how resourceful she was, how organized she was, and that even that person ends up in a far worse place at the end of the book than she started at the beginning. And the beginning is her going into labor in a homeless shelter. That, I think, is a very dark lesson for us to all learn. So there's what it takes as an individual, which she is a model of, but then there's what it takes systemically. And that is something that she cannot fight as an individual. We have this myth in this country that it's all on you, right? And if you can make it work, then you make it work, but you can't make it work. And that, I think, is the real lesson. And that is a lesson that she had to learn during a time when she wasn't, battling now 36 million more people for a check the welfare office.
The red tape is not a bug, it's a feature.
Exactly.
So you just mentioned luck, and I feel like I've been fascinated by the concept of luck for a long time. Writing about Wall Street teach you that a lot of people who think they're smart are just lucky. But what did this book teach you about luck?
Oh, that's so interesting, because I learned the opposite, which is that there's no such thing as luck in this system. That, for example, so here's Camilla's luckiest moment. She applies for over 75 affordable housing lotteries. And this is how hard it is to get your name to come up in an affordable housing lottery. Each building with affordable housing has its own lottery. And a very limited number of apartments. And so, for example, she applied for one building in downtown Brooklyn, and she was one of 90,000 names on that list. There's another one that she applied for, and I think that this is the one that, spoiler, she actually had her name come up for. She was one of 70,000 names. So right there, that is extraordinary luck. She, her name came up in the affordable housing lottery, but the minimum income permitted to actually get an affordable apartment for a tiny studio was $56,000 a year. That's the American median household income. For a 2-bedroom, which is what she wanted, which, by the way, a woman raising a child, that is not an unreasonable desire to have your son grow up in a separate bedroom for yourself. The minimum was $121,000 for an affordable apartment. And so the notion of affordability, the notion of what our policy actually supports, is so ridiculous that even when your name comes up, when you are that lucky, it is impossible. And these lotteries are rare. In most cases, for example, she was trying to get an apartment in NYCHA in the New York City Housing Authority projects. And for a lot of people, an apartment in the projects, that's like their worst nightmare. But for 250,000 people, that's their greatest dream, because that's how many people are on that list, 150,000 families. And there's no luck there. pretty much the only way you get moved up the list is if you can prove two police interventions in domestic violence in the course of a year or two. So I guess if you're lucky, you have a case like that, and who knows what that even does for you. And so this is what luck means if you live in poverty in New York City, as an example. But frankly, I don't think that any of these examples are that different anywhere else in the country.
What a crushing story. It sounds like someone in a desert finding an oasis, and they get there and the oasis is empty.
It does really feel like that. And, she is such a determined and such a hopeful person that she's someone who believes that she can will these oases to exist. And she basically does. And she basically convinces herself, there it is. It's real. I see it. How can I manifest the water? And if there's anyone I've ever met who could manifest water in the desert, it is Camilla. And yet, I think that that's part of why this story, while it's a real tragedy in many ways, people who have been reading it keep saying, I was so gripped, I was so inspired, it felt so hopeful, because this notion of how she buoys herself carries us through the whole book, I think. And so even though I'm talking about all of this darkness, she is so self-propelling that there is all this tremendous light. That's why when I watched the light go out in her, it felt so, I think, brutally dark.
So last question, what did working with her for all this time teach you personally, specifically for this moment? How did it prepare you for the pandemic?
That's a very good question. I would say, I wrote this book. I chose to spend my time reporting and writing this book because I knew that it was really bad, right? I didn't choose to prove that things are really fine. It's not like I changed as a person having my eyes open to how horrible poverty is. Obviously, that's what led me to the topic. But these questions of administrative burden, these questions of the total irrelevance of luck, watching someone who was so well equipped to succeed not be able to do it. That is what I really learned on a granular level of what it is like to live with that weight day in and day out. And I think that that is one of the elements of life for a majority of Americans that we all need to wake up to, which is not just people of incredible power or privilege, but also people who are in dire straits, but who still self-identify as middle class, who are really part of a class system that is, I think, sinking people in a certain way. One of the things that I learned in reporting this book was, so it takes place, a lot of it in a shelter where there's a soup kitchen downstairs for street homeless people mainly. I mean, for anyone who knows it, who needs it, but that's who shows up. And a shelter for expectant and new mothers upstairs. And the mothers upstairs would refer to the people downstairs at the soup kitchen as the bums. They would refer to them as the homeless people. And it's really interesting to see all these different ways that people who have been so screwed by this country and who are so screwed by the system still need to distance themselves within a hierarchy of need and within a hierarchy of identity. And I think that we as Americans have done that up rung after rung after rung. And I think that what is happening right now, and we'll see how this develops in this unprecedented economic crisis, is the notion of holding on to a level of economic power of class as a form of dignity and of self-respect that I think distances us from the crises of people who we separate ourselves from. I think that's true for people who are rich and people who are poor alike. And I'm hoping that there is a way of knitting together notions of care and empathy without having to self-identify differently in order to do that, if that makes any sense.
This could all bring us closer together, or it could tear us apart even further, I think.
Yeah, I'm worried about those divisions, I have to say, when that's the opposite of what we need.
Yeah. Lauren Sandler, the book is called This Is All I Got. a new mother's search for home. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Bob.